to turn to the book of Job. Book of Job. We'll get to our text later, but the book of Job, of course, is written in story format with very little narrative. The narrative occurs in chapters 1 and 2. So most of the story is told through dialogue, and really the point of the story of Job does not really emerge until toward the end of the book. But though it's written in story format, it is not religious fiction. Job was a real person, not some imaginary character. If you keep a mark there in Job and go over to the book of Ezekiel, we see that Ezekiel refers to him as a real person. Ezekiel 14:14. Though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they should deliver, but their own souls by their righteousness, saith the Lord God. And you see the same thing in verse 20, though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it. So it's a real person. James chapter 5, verse 11, ye have heard of the patience of Job. So Job is a real person. Though the narrative section is mostly about the suffering of Job, likewise, the dialogue portion of the book, which is most of the book, also is about the suffering of Job. Yet it is a book that is filled with God. Everywhere you turn in the book of Job, there is God. In fact, it is a revelation, an unveiling of God. The conclusion of the book is basically God is the answer. That's the basic conclusion of the book. God is the answer. And that's our subject. God the answer. Before we get to our text, we want to consider the format of the book. It opens in chapter 1, verse 1, with the character of Job. We see that he was perfect, not sinless, but he was perfect and upright. He feared God. He eschewed or avoided evil. And then moves to verses 2 and 3 to the prosperity of Job. He's happy. He's healthy. He's wealthy. He's surrounded by his wife and his 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. He also has an endorsement from God. God said to Satan in Job 1 verse 8, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him in the earth. This is God speaking. There's none like him. A perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. But then, as we all know, there came a day that brought great adversity to his life. In one day, verses 13 through 19 of chapter 1, without any notice whatsoever, his 10 children are killed. His wealth is taken. In one day, everything seemingly falls apart. And Job bore this calamity with amazing submission. Job 1, verse 21 and 22, he says, naked came I out of my mother's womb. Naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And then it says, in all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. That doesn't mean that held true all through the book. In chapter 2, Job is smitten with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet, so his health is now gone. Sorrow fills his heart, pain ravishes his body, and he's seen sitting in the ashes, scraping himself with a broken piece of pottery. And his wife, who was suffering as well, seeing him there, says to him in chapter 2, verse 9, "Curse God and die." She is saying, "Job, are you still going to worship and serve God? Can't you see? We don't have anything left. Everything's gone. There's nothing to live for." It's basically what she's saying to Job. So there is Job. He's lost his children, his riches, his health, his status. The fact that his wife is suffering, no doubt, was an overwhelming heartache to him as well. And then he hears these words from her, and that would also increase his anguish. Yet we come to Job 2, verse 10, "And all this did not Job sin with his lips." That doesn't mean that held true throughout the whole book. But at this point, this was the case. So while Job is sitting there in the ashes, some of his friends who had heard of his trouble, heard of his calamities, they arrive, and it says there in chapter 2, verse 11, that they are come to mourn with him and to comfort him. And I believe that that was their intention. But as time passed, they did anything but. And we read in chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, that they wept with him for 7 days. No one said a word. They just sat in silence with him. Chapter 3, Job is now in perplexity about what has happened, and he breaks the silence in verses 12 and verses 2 through 13 of chapter 3, and basically he says this: "I wish I'd never been born. Wish I'd never been born." Job's friends, in their desire to know and understand why is Job suffering like this, and they began to analyze. That was one of their mistakes. And as they analyzed, they came to the conclusion that the severity of Job's suffering was due to some grievous sin in his life. So their conclusion is God is punishing Job for something. Having concluded that, they absolutely refuse to move from their conclusion. They are absolutely certain this is the case. And it wasn't the case. Most of the book records the conversations that took place between Job and his friends. And there's a cycle. His friends would accuse him, and Job would defend himself. And you can follow that all the way through chapter 31, basically. And all of this only increased the misery of Job. And in these continued cycles of discourse, the theology of Job's friends is not erroneous. Their theology is pretty sound. It's just shallow. It's just shallow. And their application of their theology to Job's situation is erroneous. So they have pretty sound theology, but they're shallow, and therefore their application becomes erroneous. Now there's a lesson there. There's many lessons. Seeking to explain God and the tragedy, they fail to comfort Job. They're trying to figure it all out. And they try to explain God to Job. And has Job's friends explained the justice and the character of God, Job grows increasingly distraught over his situation. And Job begins to waver. He begins to, where he made his mistake, is he began to insist, rather than just leave it with God, he began to insist upon his own righteousness. May I say, that is always a dangerous road. That's a dangerous road. And insisting upon his own righteousness, he began to think that God was ignoring him. God was treating him unfairly. Always a dangerous road. So, in the last response to Eliphaz, chapters 22 and 23, he stated in chapter 23, verses 3 and 4, that he desired to defend himself before God. He is saying, I want a hearing before God. I will defend myself. I have done nothing wrong. God is treating me unfairly. And I will defend myself before Him. And in his last response to Bildad in chapters 26 through 31, he desires that God would respond to him so that he could defend himself before God. So what had become the main focus of Job? Defending his righteousness. That has now become the main focus of Job. And any time we get our eyes upon our faithfulness, you're going down the wrong road. And it's not going to end in a good place. Anytime we begin to think that God is treating us unfairly, we have overrated our faithfulness, and we are again going down the wrong path. Anytime anyone thinks that they're being mistreated by God, you have overestimated yourself. You have overestimated your righteousness, your faithfulness. So Job is heading down the wrong path. In Job 32, verse 1, we read, so these three men ceased to answer Job. They're saying, we give up, we can't talk to you. Because he was righteous in his own eyes. Remember, their conclusion is, Job, you've sinned. And Job just digs his heels in more and more. No, I haven't sinned. But sitting by was a young man named Elihu. And he sat through this dialogue silently. But in chapters 32 through 37, he speaks. And he does so in wrath to Job's friends. He's rebuking them for not answering the question of suffering, and for condemning Job without being able to pin anything upon him. And then he's also rebuking Job for justifying himself. So Elihu had more wisdom than all the other friends. And all of this sets the stage for our text in Job 38. Remember, Job demands an answer from God. I want to defend myself before God. Job 38, verses 1 through 3. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. So I believe a storm had come in. And in this storm, God answered Job. I want a trial before God. I want to defend myself before God. And he says in verse 2, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? In other words, Job was muddying the waters. And then he says, gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. He's saying, okay, Job, I'm not going to answer you, but you're going to answer me. I've got some questions for you. And that brings us to the questions of God to Job. Coming to our text again, a storm has gathered. Out of that storm, God speaks directly to Job. In verse 2, the Lord begins with a rebuke of Job, the manner in which he had spoken to God, or of God. Words without knowledge. Words without knowledge. In other words, he's saying, Job, you've said a lot and you speak ignorantly. And as time went on, Job began to focus upon himself rather than God. So in verse 3, he says to Job, gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. So what he's saying is, Job, brace yourself, and I'll question you. You're not the one asking the questions. I will question you. And then God proceeds to ask Job over 180 questions in chapters 38 through 41. Can you imagine? God, you and God face to face, and God asking you over 180 questions. That's what happens. As God asks these questions, Job basically stands there with his mouth open, not saying a word. He sat in silence, unable to answer a single question. Remember, Job wants to defend himself before God. Job's focus is all wrong. So with these questions, basically what God is doing is He's challenging Job's competence to judge God's ways. He's basically saying, who are you to judge me? Who are you to judge me? Why was God asking Job all of these questions? Well, Job was in trouble. And the trouble was not that he had lost everything. He was beginning to be in trouble spiritually. He was at the point in his suffering when he was trying to figure everything out, and he was beginning to question God. It is easy in our suffering to become self-centered rather than God-centered. And this is what has happened to Job. Job, in defending himself before his friends, has become self-centered, and he has lost focus of God. So I believe that God asked these questions to Job to bring Job to see his inadequacy and his inability to meet God as an equal. That's what Job wanted. I want a meeting with God and I'll defend myself. You don't meet with God as an equal. God asks these questions to get Job's focus, his attention upon God. The purpose of the questions is God revealing Himself to Job, but also revealing and manifesting Job's insignificance. So to rescue Job from the path that he was heading down, he asks these questions. So as the friends of Job and Job himself were in search of answers to human needs and human problems, God asks these questions to cause Job to realize God is the answer. You can think all day, and whatever answers you come up with does not change the fact that God is the answer. So these questions from God to Job teach us that the answer to man's problems is not an explanation about God. That's what Job's friends wanted to do. But a revelation of God. An explanation about God will not solve the problem. A revelation of God, a manifestation of God. That's the answer. So regardless of your condition, regardless of your situation, we all need a deeper and more clear revelation of who God is. And that's the purpose of these questions. Now we'll summarize the interrogation without reading it in its entirety. I would challenge you to do so. Notice that God, in these questions, God never gives Job an answer to the mystery of suffering. That's what Job's friends want to know. Why? Why did all this befall Job? Why? God never gave the answer. The why, other than, I'm God. And we, like Job, we get sidetracked. Why? So he reminds Job in these questions that he is the creator. He is the sustainer of all things. He's manifesting His infinity, His vastness, His immensity. God was manifesting to Job His greatness through these questions. He's reminding Job that he excels and goes beyond all else. He's reminding Job, I know what I'm doing. I am omniscient. He is reminding Job that he's omnipotent. He is absolute sovereign. Job thought that he understood and comprehended God. But again, for you and I to understand and comprehend God, God would have to be very, very small. So in asking these questions to Job, God is telling him, Job, you don't need to figure me out. You don't need to figure me out. You don't need to be able to explain me. You do not need to understand me. But you do need to trust me. That is basically what God is telling Job. And that is still true today. You don't have to figure God out. You don't have to be able to explain God or know why. But you need to trust Him. You need to trust Him. Again, the answer to Job's problems was not an explanation about God, but a revelation of God. And the same is true today. Now the questions are in the form of where, who, what, when. That's the form of these questions. He begins in verses 4 through verse 38, questioning Job regarding inanimate matter. And again, that's seen in verses 4 through 38. He begins with creation in verses 4 through 11. He begins by asking, Job, where were you when I created the universe? Where were you? It is as if he were saying, Job, you weren't there. You weren't there when I created everything, and you don't know how I did it. That is, by personal experience. I laid the foundation of the earth all by myself. In other words, I didn't need your intelligence, and I don't need it now. I didn't need your input. I didn't need your advice. I didn't need your help. And I don't now either. We need to be reminded of that every now and then. In verses 8 through 11, he asks Job some questions regarding oceanography. He says, where were you, Job, when I created the waters and set their bounds? God is revealing himself not only as the creator, but as the controller. In verses 12 through 38, God asks Job questions concerning the marvels of the present world. God asks Job in verse 12, have you ever made the sun to rise? Have you ever made the sun set? Why, in order to do that, you would have to control the earth's rotation. Job, have you ever done that? Have you ever done that? If the whole population of the world worked together, they could not control the earth's rotation. But God does. Every day. The point is, God is wiser than you. God is more able than you. So trust Him. In verse 16, God focuses upon the depth and the breadth of sea and land. The point is that man is extremely limited in his knowledge of the earth. I don't care how well you study something. You're extremely limited in your knowledge. In verse 17, he asks, have you seen what lies beyond death? I mean, we've been told what lies beyond death. But have any of us seen it? No. No one here has seen it. In verse 18, he asks, have you comprehended the vastness of the earth? In verses 19 through 21, God asks Job about light and dark. He says, where's the dwelling place of light? Where does it dwell? Where's the dwelling place of darkness? Where were you when these were created? Where were you, Job, when I separated light and darkness? Can you take light and direct its course? Can you take darkness and direct its course? Where were you? Job, where were you when light and darkness had their bounds assigned to them? In verses 22 through 30, God asked Job about snow and hail and rain and frost. He says, Job, do you know anything at all about how to store up snow? How to store up hail? Do you know how to make it rain? Do you know how many snowflakes are scheduled to fall? No, Job, you don't know any of these things. But I do. So, Job, you need to just trust me. You just need to trust me. In providing snow, hail, rain, and frost, God exercises His sovereign control. In order for it to rain or snow, water must be carried up into the sky and then released back to land. And who does that? Well, God does. He carries it to the sky and releases it to land, just as He measures. Job, do you know how to do that? Do you know how to make it snow, Job? Do you know how to make it rain? Are you able to do that? In verses 31 through 33, he turns his attention to the stars and the planets. And he says, do you know the laws of heaven? Can you establish their rule upon earth? In verse 34, can you speak so that the clouds will cover you with rain? Can you do that, Job? Verse 35, can you call and the lightnings come? Can you do that? I can. Trust me. Can you send the lightning and control it? In verse 37, can you count the clouds in your wisdom? Can you prevent it from raining? And on it goes. And then he asks some questions about animate matter. And that's seen beginning with verse 39 of chapter 38, continuing through verse 30 of chapter 39. In verses 39 through 41 of chapter 38, God asks Job if he's able and if he knows how to provide for the lions when they're hungry. If he's able to provide for the ravens. Again, God is in sovereign control. God can and does lead the raccoon to cross the road at the very moment that a car is traveling the same road, striking the raccoon, providing food for the raven. God does that. Man doesn't do that. God does these things every day. And God has taught all of animal creation how to find food. He teaches them this. In chapter 39, verses 1 through 4, God asked Job, are you present at the birth of animals worldwide? He's saying, I am. I'm there for the birth of every one of them. Always have been. Do you know when the mountain goats bring forth? God is saying, think about it, Job. I'm here for all these things. And I know how to do all of these things. Every deer that gives birth, God's there. Every mountain goat that gives birth, God is there. Every possum that gives birth, God is there. Job, are you there? Knowledge must be mighty limited then. In verses 5 through 8, God asked Job, who hath sent out the wild ass free? Or who hath loosed the bands of the wild ass? Job, you look at those animals and you think they're out of control. And they're unpredictable. But I set them loose. And they're under my control. And Job, you don't have anything to do with it. And so it goes with the wild ox, verses 9 through 12. He's saying, you look at the wild ox, you think that's just an uncontrollable animal. But I know how to bind him and use him. He's mine. In verse 13, God asked Job, do you give the beautiful feathers to the peacock? Was it you that gave feathers and wings to the ostrich? Was that you, Job? No, that was me. Trust me, is what God is saying to Job. Quit trying to figure it out and just trust me. I'm God. He goes on to say, verses 14 through 18, that even the foolishness of the creature is by God's own design. You take the stupidest animals on earth, and God is saying, that's by my design. I made them that way. I made them that way. In verses 19 through 25, God asked Job about the war horse. Job, did you give the horse strength? Do you know how to do that, Job? In verses 26 through 30, he says, is it by your wisdom that the hawk soars and flies south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? Do you do that, Job? In chapter 40, if we turn over there, we read of Job's response. Again, remember, I want to defend myself before God. In other words, I'll tell God. Well, look at how Job responds. Verse 1 of chapter 40. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. Then that's what Job was doing. He was reproving God. That's the road he was going down. Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay mine hand upon my mouth. That's wise. Rather than reproving God, just put your hand over your mouth and keep it shut. And that's what Job is doing. Once have I spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. Then answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind and said. And then it goes on from there. And in chapter 40, verse 6 through verse 34 of chapter 41, God proceeds to ask Job more questions. He gives Job more to think about. The application of this to you and I. These were all rhetorical questions. They weren't designed for Job to answer, but simply to make a point. The point being was to show that God is bigger than Job. The point of all the questions is God is bigger than you and I. He's also bigger than the problems that we have. So the questions were designed to provoke thought concerning God. And with each question, God challenges the thinking of Job. You run across it all the time. People run their mouth about something. It could be anything. It could be Bible. It could be anything. And they're just so certain. And you just ask a simple question. Well, I never thought of that. Perhaps you need to think about it a little more. And that was what the problem here was with Job. God just asked these questions, and Job finally comes to the realization, you know what, I don't know anything. So with these questions, God challenged Job's competence to judge God's ways. None of us are competent to judge the ways of God. None of us are. People will ask questions all the time. Well, why do you think God did such and such? I would suggest to you, don't go down that road. Don't go down that road. Just trust Him. Just trust Him. So the questions were designed to reveal the greatness of God and the insignificance of man. The questions reveal God is bigger than we can imagine. God is over all. God is a God who can. And He's not indifferent toward man. The questions are a revelation. And they are also a call. Again, it's easy in our suffering and in our trials to become self-centered rather than God-centered. And that's exactly what was happening to Job. So God asked these questions to refocus Job's attention upon God. And as the friends of Job and Job himself are searching for answers to great human needs and problems, God asked these questions to cause them to realize that God is the answer. You and I do not need to look anywhere else for the answers. God is the answer. What Job needed in his suffering were not answers. But what Job needed was a clear vision of who God is. And that's so with you and I. What we need is not necessarily answers, but what we need is a clear view upon who God is. So what was God's answer? Himself. God's answer was Himself. So with these questions, God is telling Job, Job, you don't need to figure me out. You don't need to fully understand, but you do need to trust me. You do need to trust me to the point where you can lean upon me and cleave to me and draw from me. So with these questions, God was teaching Job to trust, not based on why, but who. So that presents the question. When we trust God, what is that trust based on? What is it based on? And that's a good question to answer. What is our trust based on? Is it why? Because we just know? No, the only right answer to that question is who. The basis of trusting God is because who He is, not because of why He does something, but who He is. You need no other reason to trust God than who He is. He's God. Trust Him. And that's what God is telling Job in all of these questions. So Job was beginning to falter and go down a wrong path. And God revealed Himself. And Job realized his own insignificance. Notice in chapter 42, verse 3. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not. Oh, people do that all the time. Things too wonderful for me, which I knew not. This is where these questions bring Job. Verse 5. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear. That is, I have heard of God, but now mine eye seeth thee. Big difference. Big difference. He says, I heard all about you, but now I've experienced you. Wherefore, I abhor myself. He's not interested in defending himself anymore. He's not interested in defending his righteousness. I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. In all of our problems, in all of our needs, what we need is to experience the majesty of God. And oh, that the truths concerning God in these questions would sink deep into our hearts and transform our perspective. Someone asked, why did a baby die? Why? Tell me why God allowed that to happen. All you can say is you just need to trust Him. There's no sense in getting, well, it was God's will and just go on and on. They're not going to understand that anyway. Just need to point to God. Trust Him. Just trust Him. Why should I trust Him after He let that baby die? Why you should trust Him? Because He's God. Don't get caught up on the why, but the who. Trust Him because of who He is. So, for a revelation of God that would cause us to know His greatness and our insignificance. He's the answer. He's a God you can trust upon, a God you can lean upon. You'll never, ever figure out God. Will not happen. You won't even come close. Won't happen because God's too great for our minds to figure it out. So don't bother. Just trust Him. Just trust Him. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us